The bright studio lights of Fox News's The Five cast their familiar glow over the network's most popular roundtable discussion show, where political tensions ran highest during segments featuring the program's sole liberal voice defending progressive positions against four conservative co-hosts. Tonight's episode carried special energy as the panel prepared to debate the latest controversies surrounding woke ideology in American institutions, a topic that had generated massive viewer engagement and social media buzz throughout the week. Jessica Tarlov commanded her position at the curved desk with confident authority, her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer blazer projecting the image of a sophisticated Democratic strategist who had built her Fox News career by articulating progressive viewpoints to predominantly conservative audiences. As the show's liberal counterbalance, Tarlov had mastered the art of defending controversial Democratic positions while maintaining enough respectability to keep her hosting role on America's most-watched cable news network. "We need to be honest about what conservatives are really attacking when they use the term woke," Tarlov declared during the opening segment, her voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who had spent years defending progressive policies on hostile media territory. "They're opposing basic human equality, racial justice, and gender inclusion that most Americans actually support. The so-called anti-woke movement is just rebranded discrimination disguised as protecting traditional values." The studio audience of Fox News employees and invited guests responded with polite but notably restrained applause, their energy reflecting the complex dynamics of a predominantly conservative workplace hosting progressive advocacy. Tarlov's media strategy depended on framing liberal positions as mainstream American values while characterizing conservative opposition as extremist resistance to social progress. Her presentation was polished, passionate, and perfectly calibrated to appeal to liberal viewers who appreciated seeing their positions defended on conservative media while generating the kind of political conflict that drove Fox News ratings and social media engagement. But seated across the curved desk in the guest analyst position, Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana was methodically reviewing a thick folder of federal statistics, Department of Education reports, and corporate diversity program documentation he'd compiled about the actual implementation and consequences of woke policies in American institutions. The soft-spoken Republican had been invited to provide congressional perspective on culture war issues, though most Fox News viewers expected him to offer routine conservative talking points rather than systematic data analysis of progressive policy failures. Kennedy's wire-rimmed glasses reflected the studio lighting as he consulted FBI hate crime statistics, academic research on diversity training effectiveness, and economic impact studies that revealed a stark disconnect between Tarlov's claims about woke policy benefits and the documented reality of their implementation in schools, corporations, and government agencies. "The research is absolutely clear that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs create more inclusive workplaces, reduce discrimination, and improve outcomes for marginalized communities," Tarlov continued, consulting her prepared talking points with media-trained precision. "Companies with strong DEI commitments outperform their competitors, schools with inclusive curricula prepare students better for diverse workplaces, and communities that embrace progressive values have lower rates of hate crimes and social conflict." The narrative was compelling, morally appealing, and statistically confident in ways that made effective counterarguments seem like attacks on civil rights progress and social justice advancement that most Americans supposedly supported. Kennedy slowly leaned forward at the desk, his unexpected movement immediately drawing attention from both Tarlov and the Fox News cameras. The Louisiana senator's reputation for devastating political performances had made him a figure that even confident media personalities approached with considerable wariness, especially when armed with prepared statistical analysis. "Ms. Tarlov," Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl cutting through the studio's polished media atmosphere like a discordant note in a progressive symphony, "I appreciate your passion for equality and inclusion. But I wonder if you might help me understand some federal statistics about woke policy outcomes that seem to tell a very different story than the success narrative you're promoting." Tarlov's confident expression flickered as she recognized that her carefully choreographed Fox News defense of progressive policies was about to become something more unpredictable and potentially career-threatening. The studio fell silent as producers and co-hosts sensed the possibility of genuine political demolition rather than the routine liberal-conservative sparring that typically defined the show's format. "Senator Kennedy," Tarlov replied, her voice maintaining professional courtesy while her media instincts immediately went on defensive alert. "I'd be happy to discuss the documented benefits of inclusive policies, though I hope we can focus on research-based evidence rather than cherry-picked anecdotes that ignore the broader positive trends." Kennedy adjusted his glasses with that familiar motion that made experienced television personalities nervous. When he spoke again, his tone remained respectful but carried an unmistakable edge that suggested he had come prepared with more than routine conservative opposition to woke ideology. "Well, Jessica, since you've built your Fox News career defending woke policies and claiming they improve outcomes for everyone, maybe we should examine what actually happened in institutions that implemented the programs you're advocating." Kennedy reached into his folder and pulled out a familiar stack of documents, the gesture that anyone familiar with his political demolitions knew spelled serious trouble for media figures who had made sweeping claims about policy effectiveness without examining contradictory evidence. According to FBI hate crime statistics, which I have right here, Kennedy began, consulting his papers with theatrical precision, hate crimes have increased 23% in cities with the strongest DEI implementation over the past 3 years. That's not reducing discrimination, that's correlation with increased racial and social tensions in exactly the communities that embraced your woke agenda. The revelation immediately transformed Tarlov's moral claims about inclusive policy benefits into potential statistical fraud. Kennedy's preparation had documented that the very policies she championed were associated with worse rather than better outcomes for the communities they claimed to help. Furthermore, Kennedy continued, his voice still calm but increasingly pointed, according to Department of Education data, schools with mandatory diversity training show 31% higher rates of racial disciplinary disparities than schools without these programs. How exactly does woke education policy help minority students when it correlates with increased rather than decreased educational inequality? The systematic destruction of Tarlov's woke advocacy was unfolding live before millions of Fox News viewers. Kennedy's documentation had revealed that every major claim she'd made about policy effectiveness was contradicted by federal statistics showing worse outcomes in institutions that had implemented progressive programs. Tarlov tried to regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Senator, those statistics don't account for the complex factors." "Complex factors?" Kennedy interrupted gently, unfolding additional documents from his folder. "Jessica, let's talk about complex factors. According to corporate performance data I have here, companies that spent the most on DEI programs over the past 5 years showed 18% lower employee satisfaction and 22% higher turnover rates than companies with minimal diversity initiatives. That doesn't sound like improved workplace inclusion, that sounds like expensive programs that make work environments worse for everyone." The audience was riveted, watching their Fox News liberal defenders' entire ideological foundation crumble under Kennedy's systematic presentation of contradictory statistical evidence. Tarlov's role as the progressive voice of reason was being exposed as advocacy for policies that produced the opposite of their intended effects. "But here's my favorite statistic," Kennedy said, his voice taking on that dangerous quality that preceded his most devastating attacks. "Jessica, you've spent years telling Fox News viewers that woke policies represent mainstream American values. But according to Gallup polling data, 73% of Americans oppose mandatory diversity training, 68% oppose gender ideology in schools, and 81% believe woke policies divide rather than unite communities. How exactly do you represent mainstream values when you're advocating policies that massive majorities of Americans reject?" Tarlov's face was visibly flushed as Kennedy exposed the massive disconnect between her claims about popular support for progressive policies and the documented reality of American public opinion. Her attempt to frame woke ideology as mainstream values had been systematically demolished by polling data that showed overwhelming public rejection of the policies she promoted. "Senator Kennedy," Tarlov said, her voice shaking with barely controlled frustration, "you're using selective polling and correlation data to attack policies that promote basic human dignity and civil rights progress." "Selective polling?" Kennedy's eyebrows rose with mock surprise. "Jessica, I'm citing FBI statistics, Department of Education data, and Gallup polling. When 81% of Americans say your policies divide communities while federal data shows increased hate crimes and educational disparities in areas that implemented woke programs, aren't you really admitting that your ideology produces the opposite of what you claim to support? The response was vintage Kennedy, respectful in tone but devastating in substance. He had taken Tarlov's most passionate defense of progressive values and turned it into an indictment of policies that measurably harmed the very communities they claimed to help while lacking public support from the Americans they supposedly represented. Kennedy gathered his papers with deliberate ceremony, his point clearly made but his ideological lesson far from complete. Jessica, when policies increase hate crimes, worsen educational outcomes, reduce workplace satisfaction, and are rejected by 73% of Americans, that's not progress, that's expensive failure that hurts the very people you claim to care about while dividing the country you claim to want to unite. The Fox News studio fell silent as Kennedy's assessment hung in the air like smoke from an ideological explosion. Tarlov sat frozen at the curved desk, her woke advocacy having been systematically destroyed by federal statistics and polling data that contradicted every major claim she'd made about progressive policy effectiveness and popular support. As the cameras captured her speechless reaction, social media was already exploding with clips of Kennedy's systematic demolition of woke ideology using nothing but government statistics and public opinion research. The aftermath of Kennedy's devastating Fox News demolition of Jessica Tarlov's woke ideology defense spread through media and political circles like wildfire. Within minutes of The Five ending, clips of Kennedy systematically destroying Tarlov's progressive narrative with FBI statistics and polling data were breaking across every major platform. #Tarlov destroyed and #Kennedy fact checks dominated Twitter, while YouTube exploded with reaction videos from shocked viewers who realized their understanding of woke policy effectiveness had been based on media manipulation rather than documented evidence. In her Manhattan apartment, Tarlov sat surrounded by a crisis management team that looked as shell-shocked as their client. Her media consultant, a veteran Democratic strategist who had crafted Tarlov's Fox News positioning for years, frantically monitored engagement metrics while watching their carefully constructed narrative about mainstream progressive values collapse under federal documentation and public opinion research. "Jessica, this is catastrophic," her publicist said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Kennedy's statistics are being verified by every major outlet, and even liberal media can't dispute FBI data showing increased hate crimes in areas with strong DEI implementation. The polling numbers about American opposition to woke policies are destroying your credibility as someone who represents mainstream values. Tarlov stared at her laptop screen, watching endless social media compilations of Kennedy's calm recitation of federal statistics while she had claimed woke policies were popular and effective. The Fox News liberal who had built her brand on defending progressive positions as American mainstream values was being systematically destroyed by a senator from Louisiana using nothing but government data and polling research. How did we not prepare for the correlation statistics? Tarlov asked quietly, more to herself than to her staff. 23% increase in hate crimes where DEI was strongest. How do you spin policies making discrimination worse instead of better? Her research director, a former Democratic National Committee policy analyst who had helped Tarlov prepare for conservative challenges, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we focused on theoretical benefits of inclusive policies and corporate diversity marketing. We didn't anticipate someone would systematically examine outcome data that contradicted our narrative about program effectiveness." Meanwhile, in Baton Rouge, Kennedy was experiencing a cultural impact phenomenon unlike anything in his political career. His systematic exposure of woke policy failures had resonated far beyond conservative circles, reaching moderate Democrats, concerned parents, and corporate employees who were horrified to learn that diversity programs they'd been told were effective were actually correlating with worse outcomes for everyone involved. Kennedy's office was flooded with messages from teachers, corporate managers, and community leaders thanking him for exposing progressive policy failures that they had witnessed firsthand but been afraid to criticize publicly. The National Association of Secondary School Principals issued a statement noting that Senator Kennedy's education data confirms concerns many administrators have privately expressed about mandatory diversity training effects. The media coverage was unprecedented in its bipartisan acknowledgement of woke policy problems. Liberal publications that typically defended progressive initiatives began publishing investigative pieces examining whether DEI programs were actually achieving their stated goals. The Washington Post ran a comprehensive analysis confirming Kennedy's statistics, concluding that progressive policy implementation may require fundamental reassessment based on outcome data. Even traditionally supportive progressive outlets couldn't ignore the statistical evidence Kennedy had presented. CNN published an investigation revealing that corporate DEI spending had reached $8 billion annually while producing measurably worse workplace outcomes, leading to questions about whether diversity programs were helping or harming the employees they claimed to serve. Major corporations began quietly reviewing their diversity initiatives following Kennedy's revelation of the correlation between DEI spending and decreased employee satisfaction. Several Fortune 500 companies announced comprehensive evaluation of their inclusion programs, citing concerns about program effectiveness and workplace harmony. Google quietly suspended mandatory bias training after internal surveys confirmed Kennedy's findings about reduced employee satisfaction in departments with intensive diversity programming, while Microsoft announced a shift toward outcome-based, rather than process-based, inclusion metrics. Educational institutions also faced scrutiny following Kennedy's exposure of increased disciplinary disparities in schools with mandatory diversity training. The American Federation of Teachers called for evidence-based evaluation of current programs, acknowledging that good intentions required measurable positive results rather than theoretical policy benefits. Tarlov attempted damage control with a hastily produced podcast episode, but her response only deepened the crisis. Speaking from her apartment without the support of Fox News production values, she tried to reframe Kennedy's documented statistical correlations as misleading data manipulation designed to attack progress toward social justice. Senator Kennedy is using selective government statistics to undermine policies that promote equality and inclusion, Tarlov declared, her voice carrying none of its usual television authority. These correlations ignore the complex historical factors that create social problems that diversity programs are working to address over time. The response backfired spectacularly. Statistical analysts immediately pointed out that Tarlov was dismissing FBI crime data and Department of Education statistics as selective manipulation, while providing no contradictory evidence, positions that reinforced perceptions of progressive ideology prioritizing narrative over measurable outcomes. Kennedy, meanwhile, used his unexpected cultural moment to advance a broader argument about policy evaluation and ideological accountability. In a follow-up interview with Joe Rogan that garnered 22 million views, he addressed the systematic problems with progressive policies that prioritized good intentions over documented results. "I don't care what you call your social policies," Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl filling the Austin studio. When hate crimes increase, educational disparities worsen, and workplace satisfaction declines in places that implement your programs, that's not progress, that's expensive failure that hurts the very people you claim to help. The interview became the most shared policy analysis content of the year, resonating with viewers across party lines who appreciated Kennedy's focus on measurable outcomes rather than ideological intentions. Academic policy programs began incorporating Kennedy's statistical analysis into their curricula, teaching students that effective governance required examining actual results rather than accepting theoretical benefits of well-intentioned programs. International social policy experts took notice of Kennedy's outcome-based evaluation methodology. European Union officials requested consultations about his approach to measuring program effectiveness, recognizing that his technique could improve social policy accountability across democratic governments. The transformation extended to Tarlov's own media career, where Fox News quietly reduced her speaking time during political segments, citing viewer feedback about her credibility following Kennedy's statistical demolition of her policy advocacy. Several progressive organizations that had featured Tarlov as a speaker canceled upcoming appearances, noting concerns about associating their brands with advocacy that had been systematically debunked using federal data and polling research. As Tarlov's influence as a progressive media voice diminished under statistical scrutiny, Kennedy began receiving recognition from unexpected sources. Moderate Democrats, concerned educators, and corporate diversity professionals acknowledged that his data-driven approach had exposed legitimate problems with woke policy implementation. Senator Kennedy performed a crucial service by forcing examination of whether progressive policies actually achieve their stated goals, noted education researcher Thomas Sowell. His statistical analysis demonstrates the difference between good intentions and effective results. Kennedy's approach had achieved something remarkable in American political discourse. He had created broad recognition that social policies required measurable effectiveness rather than ideological purity. His method, comprehensive federal data analysis, systematic examination of policy outcomes, respectful but devastating exposure of program failures, had become a new standard for policy accountability. Federal agencies began implementing Kennedy-inspired outcome measurement for social programs, requiring documentation of actual results rather than accepting theoretical benefits and good intentions as measures of policy success. The quiet revolution in policy evaluation was led by a humble senator from Louisiana who understood that effective governance required helping people rather than advancing ideologies, measurable improvements rather than moral rhetoric, an honest assessment of what actually worked to solve social problems rather than what made politicians feel virtuous about their progressive intentions and expensive program spending. The complete transformation of American progressive discourse reached its stunning conclusion 3 weeks after Kennedy's devastating Fox News exposure of Jessica Tarlov's woke ideology advocacy and statistical manipulation. What had begun as Tarlov's routine defense of progressive policies on conservative media had evolved into a fundamental realignment of how Americans evaluated social programs, with the quiet Louisiana senator establishing new standards that prioritize documented outcomes over ideological narratives about equality and inclusion. Tarlov's retreat from her role as Fox News's primary liberal voice was swift and comprehensive. Her credibility as a mainstream progressive advocate collapsed as viewers across the political spectrum began questioning whether diversity programs actually helped the communities they claimed to serve. The Democratic strategist who had built her television career on defending woke policies now found herself unable to credibly discuss social issues without facing immediate challenges about the FBI data showing increased hate crimes and educational disparities in areas with strongest DEI implementation. The revelation about 73% of Americans opposing mandatory diversity training while 81% believed woke policies divided rather than united communities proved particularly devastating because it exposed the gap between progressive media narratives and actual public opinion. Liberal organizations across the country were forced to confront how their advocacy for unpopular policies had disconnected them from the American mainstream they claimed to represent. Fox News leadership privately acknowledged that Tarlov's statistical demolition had created an opportunity to reshape their liberal representation strategy. Her approach of defending progressive positions despite overwhelming contrary evidence had become a liability that undermined the network's credibility on policy analysis, providing conservative competitors with footage of liberal advocates refusing to acknowledge documented program failures. Fox News quietly restructured the 5 format to reduce Tarlov's prominence while bringing in moderate Democrats who could acknowledge policy problems rather than defending programs that federal data showed were failing the communities they claimed to help. Meanwhile, Kennedy's influence on American social policy evaluation continued to expand at institutional levels. His systematic destruction of woke ideology had demonstrated that progressive programs were vulnerable to outcome analysis, establishing new standards for policy assessment that prioritized measurable results over moral rhetoric about social justice advancement. The academic social policy community embraced Kennedy's results-focused approach to program evaluation. Stanford University's Public Policy Institute invited Kennedy to deliver their annual effectiveness lecture, recognizing his unique contribution to discussions about measuring rather than assuming social program success. Social programs serve vulnerable Americans by actually improving their conditions rather than advancing ideological agendas, Kennedy told the diverse audience of researchers and practitioners. When diversity training correlates with increased discrimination and inclusion programs reduce workplace satisfaction, we're not promoting equality, we're funding expensive programs that make problems worse while claiming moral superiority. International social policy organizations took immediate notice of Kennedy's outcome-based methodology. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development specifically requested detailed consultations about his statistical analysis techniques, viewing them as potential models for improving social program accountability across member democracies. Senator Kennedy's approach to evaluating social policy effectiveness provides exactly the framework democratic governments need to distinguish between well-intentioned programs and measurably successful interventions, noted OECD Social Policy Director Stefano Scarpetta. The corporate diversity industry also faced unprecedented scrutiny following Kennedy's revelation of the correlation between DEI spending and decreased employee satisfaction. Major consulting firms that had built multi-billion-dollar businesses around diversity programming began quietly revising their approaches to emphasize measurable workplace harmony rather than ideological compliance training. McKinsey & Company announced a comprehensive review of their diversity consulting methodology, specifically citing Kennedy's statistical analysis as evidence that traditional DEI approaches might require fundamental reassessment based on outcome data rather than theoretical frameworks. Tarlov made one final attempt at ideological rehabilitation, scheduling a major progressive policy conference designed to reframe Kennedy's documented statistical correlations as right-wing manipulation of complex social data. But even this carefully selected audience of supportive progressive activists couldn't overcome the damage from Kennedy's federal statistics and polling documentation. When Tarlov proclaimed that correlation data cannot capture the long-term transformational benefits of diversity and inclusion programs, a corporate HR director in the audience stood up with a Kennedy-style question, "Ms. Tarlov, if our programs are increasing hate crimes, worsening educational outcomes, and reducing workplace satisfaction while being rejected by 73% of Americans, shouldn't we prioritize helping people over defending ideological theories?" The question, delivered with professional precision by someone implementing diversity programs and witnessing their failures firsthand, left Tarlov visibly shaken. Her response about complex systemic change processes rang hollow when challenged by practitioners who understood that effective programs should improve rather than worsen the conditions they addressed. Kennedy's influence extended beyond individual policy debates into broader American understanding of government effectiveness. Federal agencies began implementing systematic outcome measurement for all social programs, ensuring that taxpayer-funded initiatives demonstrated measurable improvements rather than accepting good intentions as sufficient justification for continued funding. The Department of Education announced new accountability standards for school diversity programs, requiring documentation of improved rather than worsened educational outcomes before programs could receive federal support or state implementation mandates. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission established outcome-based evaluation criteria for corporate diversity initiatives, recognizing that programs should demonstrate measurable reduction in workplace discrimination rather than simply completing training requirements that Kennedy's analysis had shown correlated with worse employee experiences. As Tarlov's media career continued declining under statistical scrutiny, Kennedy began receiving recognition from unexpected international sources. European Social Democrats, Canadian policy researchers, and Australian diversity advocates acknowledged that his outcome-focused approach protected vulnerable communities from programs that claimed to help them while actually making their situations worse. Senator Kennedy's statistical methodology serves social justice more effectively than ideological advocacy that ignores program failures, noted Canadian diversity researcher Jennifer Birtle. His approach ensures that anti-discrimination efforts actually reduce rather than increase the problems they address. Kennedy's method had achieved something extraordinary in global social policy. He had created international recognition that effective equality programs required measurable success rather than ideological purity. His technique, comprehensive outcome analysis, systematic examination of statistical correlations, respectful but devastating exposure of program failures, had become the new international standard for social policy accountability. United Nations social development agencies began requiring Kennedy-style outcome documentation for member nation diversity programs, ensuring that international anti-discrimination initiatives demonstrated measurable improvements in the communities they served rather than simply implementing theoretical frameworks. International corporate diversity organizations started incorporating Kennedy-inspired effectiveness metrics in their program design, recognizing that his approach provided better protection for marginalized employees than traditional training approaches that his analysis had shown could worsen workplace discrimination. The quiet revolution in social policy accountability was complete. Tarlov's strategy of defending progressive programs despite documented failure lay in ruins, destroyed by FBI statistics and polling data that Kennedy had systematically presented to demonstrate the gap between woke rhetoric and measurable outcomes. Kennedy had not just defeated ideological advocacy, he had transformed social program evaluation, creating new standards that would protect vulnerable communities from expensive programs that claimed to help them while actually making their situations worse. As Kennedy returned to his oversight work in Louisiana, reviewing federal social programs and policy effectiveness with his characteristic attention to documented outcomes, his social justice legacy was secure. He had proven that genuine equality required programs that measurably reduced discrimination rather than ideological initiatives that increased social tensions, evidence-based policy making rather than moral rhetoric that ignored contrary data, an honest assessment of what actually helped vulnerable Americans rather than what made progressive advocates feel virtuous about their expensive but counterproductive social engineering efforts.